Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to Ethiopia to take a look at marriage in their culture. It's fascinating stuff, and we've got some really interesting sources to work with,
Oh, definitely.
including
Yeah.
this scholarly article. It's called Marriages in Ethiopia. It was published in 2009 by Zuzana Augustiniak.
Great source.
Yeah, it is. And, we're going to look at how different marriage types and customs play out.
It's going to be fascinating to see how different they are from our own, Western ideas.
Yeah, and we'll even look at how they view divorce.
Really interesting.
Right.
Yeah. What fascinates me is how marriage is so intertwined with the culture and the religious beliefs in Ethiopia,
Oh, absolutely. It's a blend of Christianity and African traditions.
which makes for a really unique social landscape.
Yeah, it does. And it's important to remember that Ethiopia is a very diverse country.
Oh, huge range of ethnic and religious groups.
So when we talk about Ethiopian marriage,
I'm talking about a huge spectrum of practices and beliefs. It's not just one thing.
right, exactly.
For example, the Amhara people, who are mostly Christian and live in the highlands, they'll have very different customs from, say, the nomadic Afar and Somali communities who live in the east of the country.
Right. So let's get into some specifics, shall we?
Let's do it.
I was surprised to learn that Ethiopia has so many different marriage types. I mean,
It's not one size fits all, is it?
no, not at all.
And I think that really speaks to the values and priorities of Ethiopian society. For instance, they have several types of marriage that wouldn't be legally recognized in the Western world,
Right.
but they're still part of the fabric of their society. So it's not always about getting that piece of paper, the marriage certificate. It's about the traditions and agreements, social agreements.
Yeah, that have evolved over centuries.
Exactly.
Can you give us some examples of those different types of marriage?
Absolutely. One common type is what they call Sarat marriage.
Oh, sure.
And that's a civil ceremony that's conducted by a judge.
Okay.
And it's interesting because it usually follows a long betrothal period.
So there's an emphasis on careful consideration.
Commitment, yeah, for sure. But then you have something called Damaza marriage, which is much more like a temporary contract between a man and a woman.
So that kind of suggests a more pragmatic view of relationships.
Right, like recognizing that circumstances change and not everything has to last forever.
Yeah, it really challenges that Western ideal that marriage has to be till death do us part, right?
Totally. And for some couples, maybe it has about forever, but for others, it's about fulfilling specific needs or goals at that point in their life.
Right.
Now, couples seeking a really strong religious foundation for their marriage, they might go for a Kalkadan ceremony.
Called Kadan. Okay.
Yeah, that one's considered irrevocable.
Wow.
I think it really emphasizes the importance of faith and spirituality for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you have Samanya marriages.
Samanya.
These are based on a quasi-contract. Often it's arranged by families, particularly common with the men's people. And with this type of marriage, you often see a practice called kodasur.
Kotoser. So that's where the groom lives and works with the bride's family for a period of time.
Right. It's like a form of payment or even a demonstration of commitment.
Yeah, very different from, how we do things in the West.
Hugely. And then, we shouldn't forget about TILF, which traditionally were marriages by abduction.
Oh, wow.
I know.
That's...
Although these days, it's more broadly used for any marriage that's not arranged.
Oh, okay. So it's evolved a bit,
It has.
but it does show how different cultural norms can be around marriage.
Absolutely. Huge differences.
So we've talked about these different types of marriage, and, I'm curious to learn more about what a traditional wedding ceremony would look like, say, for the Amhara people.
Well, you can expect something really vibrant and elaborate, steeped in tradition. Lineage and virginity are still very much valued.
Oh.
Although, as you might imagine, some of those customs are fading with time.
Right.
But, families, they go to great lengths to prepare for the wedding feast, gathering all the food, drinks, gifts, and everything.
And the groom's friends, they storm the bride's house, right?
Traditionally, yes.
Yeah.
Though I imagine it's probably more of a symbolic gesture these days.
Right.
The best man also has a pretty unique role in Amara weddings.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that.
So he doesn't just plan the bachelor party, which I'm sure he still does,
Of course.
but he actually vows to protect the bride's rights within the marriage.
Wow, that's a big responsibility.
Huge. And I think it really speaks to the importance of community support in their culture.
It really does.
And after the festivities, the honeymoon, what they call Yetz Agilagozi, can last quite a while,
Oh.
anywhere from a week to 3 months.
That's a long honeymoon.
And during that time, the best man lives with the newlyweds.
Wow, talk about dedication.
Right.
That really emphasizes the idea that marriage is a communal affair.
Yeah, very different from our sort of more individualistic Western perspective.
It is. Now I'm curious, in Amhara culture, like daily life, once you're married, are there any specific customs or expectations that stand out?
Well, historically, it's been common for husbands to have relationships with other women, and often wives were expected to accept that.
Oh, wow. That's definitely a clash with Western ideas of monogamy.
Right. It's a whole different way of thinking about fidelity in relationships.
It really shows how our cultural background influences our values and expectations.
Exactly. But, this isn't necessarily true across the board for all Ethiopians.
Right, of course.
We're just talking about specific historical practices within one particular group.
It's important to remember that. So let's broaden our scope a bit, shall we? What about the Afar and the Somali communities, those nomadic communities? Their lives are so different from the Amhara. How do their traditions reflect that?
Yeah, that's a great question. For the Afar, a man's ability to provide is paramount.
It's all about providing.
Yeah. And in that environment, it's about livestock. That represents wealth, stability.
Hmm.
And historically, a man might have even been required to kill an enemy to prove his strength before being allowed to marry.
Wow, that's intense.
It is.
And what about the Somali? I read something about, I think it was the bride being adorned to entice her suitor even before the negotiations begin.
Yes. Visuals are really important for them.
It's very visual.
Of course, for nomadic people, these displays of wealth, beauty, they really matter. It's how they assess a potential partner in a world where material possessions are so important.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
It does.
Now, the Oromo people seem to have a really unique approach to marriage, especially with the concept of asena.
Ah, yes, Asena. It's quite something. Imagine a woman literally jumping over a fence to claim her husband,
Wow.
even if his family opposes.
Yeah.
It's a real statement of a woman's determination.
It certainly is.
And it led to some pretty interesting counter strategies too, like families building higher fences. Or sometimes they would send their daughters for Asena when they were still very young.
Oh, so it resulted in some child marriages, I'm guessing.
Unfortunately, yes, in some cases. It shows you how culture is always evolving, sometimes in response to challenges, sometimes to, loopholes.
Right.
It's about individual choice, societal pressures, the evolution of customs. It's all connected.
It really makes you think that there's no single right way to do marriage, even within one country like Ethiopia.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating to study. It challenges our assumptions and shows the incredible diversity of the human experience.
It does. So we've talked about how people get married, but what about when things don't work out?
Divorce.
Yeah, what can you tell us about divorce in Ethiopian culture?
Well, divorce is actually pretty common in Ethiopia,
Mm.
but it's not seen as like a negative thing or a breakdown of society or anything.
No. Yeah.
The reasons they give, which are outlined in their legal and cultural document called the Fithanagist, they can be practical things, like the husband's inability to provide.
Right.
But also, it can be about more personal reasons, like incompatibility or even mistreatment.
So they recognize that sometimes it just doesn't work out,
Exactly.
and it's not necessarily a failure.
Right. And the divorce process itself is pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
The focus is on dividing property, deciding custody, things like that.
So it sounds like there's less stigma attached to divorce in Ethiopia than, say, in some other parts of the world.
I think you're right. It's maybe seen more as just a natural part of life.
Interesting.
And remember, only one type of marriage, the kalakigan, cannot be annulled,
Right, right.
which further emphasizes the seriousness of that religious commitment.
Yeah, it does. It's fascinating to see how different cultures view these things.
It really is.
So out of all this, what stands out to you the most?
I think it's just remarkable how these marriage practices highlight the interplay between individual choice and societal expectations.
Right.
People are making choices within a framework of traditions that have been around for generations.
Yeah.
It's a dynamic process that's still going on today,
Yeah.
shaping people's lives in Ethiopia.
It makes you wonder how globalization is impacting all of these traditions. Are we seeing a shift towards more westernized views?
That's a great question, and one we'll dive into after a quick break. Stay with us. Welcome back to our deep dive on Ethiopian marriage customs. Before the break, we were talking about the amazing diversity of marriage practices across different ethnic groups in Ethiopia.
The Amhara, the Afar, the Somali, the Oromo people.
Exactly. But now I think it's time to shift gears a bit and talk about the elephant in the room,
Which is,
globalization.
ah,
How are outside influences shaping these age-old customs?
yeah, I mean, are traditional practices disappearing? Or are people finding ways to blend old and new?
Well, it's not quite as simple as traditions just vanishing. It's more of a dance, I'd say. A
Hmm.
dance between holding on to those old ways and embracing new ideas.
Okay, I like that. A dance.
Take arranged marriages, for instance. They're still common, for sure,
Mm.
but not as prevalent as they used to be, especially in the cities.
So are love marriages on the rise then?
They are. Young people are getting more education, more economic opportunities.
Right.
They want more say in who they marry, but family approval still matters a lot.
So it's not a complete rejection of tradition,
No, it's more like trying to find that middle ground.
a compromise.
Exactly.
Now, what about technology? I imagine things like social media, even dating apps are having an impact, especially among younger generations.
Oh, absolutely. Technology is playing a huge role.
Yeah.
Social media platforms allow young people to connect,
Huh.
even across vast
There's
distances.
a cultural differences.
Exactly. And dating apps, while maybe not as common as they are in some Western countries,
Sure.
they are gaining popularity, particularly in urban areas.
So it's like a whole new world opening up in terms of finding a partner. But does all this exposure to different cultures and values, does that create tension?
There's definitely the potential for clashing expectations. Let's
Yeah.
take dating before marriage, for instance. It's becoming more common, sure.
Hmm.
But in many communities, it's still very taboo. The same goes for interfaith marriages. Families can be really opposed to those. It's a balancing act, trying to embrace those new ideas while still preserving your cultural heritage.
Yeah, it's complicated. So it's not just technology changing things, it's about the values and beliefs that come along with it.
Exactly. There are no easy answers. But one thing we know about Ethiopian culture, it's resilient. It has this long history of adapting to change. Think about the influence of Christianity, of Islam, and now globalization. That adaptability, I think, is going to serve them well.
I hope so. So as Ethiopia continues to modernize, to connect with the world, what do you think the future holds for these unique marriage traditions?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's hard to say for sure,
Yeah.
but I think we'll see this blending of old and new continue.
Yeah.
Traditional values like family approval, community ties, those are strong. But they'll exist alongside more modern ideas about love and relationships, all within a more globalized world.
Right.
And who knows, maybe new traditions will emerge that reflect the experiences of this generation.
That's an exciting thought. It's great to think about how Ethiopian culture will grow and change.
Yeah.
But let's bring it back to the present for a moment. What challenges is globalization bringing to Ethiopian marriages right now?
One big one is the rising cost of living, especially in cities.
Oh, of course.
It makes it really hard for young people to afford getting married and having children. This is especially true for men, with the traditional expectation that they'll be the providers.
Right. So even finding a partner is difficult.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not just about love anymore. Economic factors are playing a bigger role, which can lead to tension, delays, and marriage.
Yeah. Which can then clash with those traditional expectations.
You got it. It's a bit of a catch-22, isn't it?
It is. Now, what about gender roles within marriage? Are we seeing any shifts there?
Well, there's definitely a growing awareness of gender equality,
Mm-hmm.
influenced by global movements,
Oh.
changing norms, all of that.
Right.
More women are getting educated, entering the workforce,
Mm-hmm.
and that's challenging those traditional expectations of women as homemakers.
So that division of labor, that classic division, is starting to blur.
Slowly but surely, yes.
Yeah.
We're seeing a shift towards more shared responsibilities, both financial and in the home.
Okay, that's encouraging. But this shift in gender roles, I imagine it's not always smooth sailing.
You're right. It can create friction, especially with older generations who might hold those more traditional views.
Right.
There can be a real disconnect between what young people want and what their families expect.
So it requires a lot of negotiation and compromise, I imagine.
It does. And it's not just about the couple. What about the extended family?
Yeah, we talked about family approval being important, but how does globalization impact that influence from, grandparents, aunts, uncles, everyone?
Well, the extended family, that's a huge part of Ethiopian culture.
Yeah.
It's not going to change overnight.
Mm.
But as young people become more independent, exposed to different ways of life, that influence might become less absolute.
So it's not cutting ties with family, but maybe redefining those relationships in a more modern context.
Exactly.
It seems like globalization is really forcing Ethiopian society to rethink its values, its beliefs about marriage and family.
You got it. It's a period of transition, of adaptation. It's really fascinating to see how different people, different communities are handling these challenges. No easy answers, that's for sure. The path ahead is full of both opportunities and obstacles.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
Shifting gender roles, economic pressures, technology, changing family dynamics. Globalization is having a huge impact. But before we get overwhelmed by the complexities,
Mm,
let's focus on some of the positive aspects.
okay.
What are some of the benefits that globalization is bringing to Ethiopian marriages?
Well, I think one of the biggest benefits is increased access to information.
Oh, yeah.
The internet,
Hmm.
social media,
Sure.
people can see all sorts of perspectives on marriage, relationships, family life.
From around the world.
Exactly. They can learn about different ways to handle conflict, communicate, how to parent, all sorts of things.
So maybe more understanding, more empathy within relationships.
Absolutely. And this access to information, it can be empowering.
Right.
People can make informed choices about their lives, their relationships. They're not bound by what they've always known.
More freedom.
Exactly. They have the freedom to explore different options to create relationships that work for them.
Now, what about the economic benefits? Has globalization led to more economic opportunities for couples in Ethiopia?
Well, that's a tricky one. While globalization has created some opportunities for sure, it's also led to more inequality.
Of course.
The benefits, they aren't easily distributed. Lots of couples are still struggling.
So it's not as simple as globalization equals prosperity.
No, not at all.
Hmm.
There are winners and losers, and we can't ignore that. We need to work towards a fairer society.
Right, where everyone has a chance. So while globalization is bringing some positive changes, it's also creating new challenges.
Exactly. It's like two sides of the same coin.
It is. It's a dynamic process with both good and bad consequences.
Absolutely. It's about looking at globalization critically, recognizing both its potential and its downsides. But for now, let's take a step back and reflect on everything we've talked about.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground, from traditional marriage customs of different ethnic groups to the impact of globalization on those practices.
We've talked about arranged marriages, bride abductions, jumping over fences for proposals.
We talked about the role of the best man.
Right. We looked at technology, shifting gender roles, those economic pressures, and we've discussed both the challenges and the opportunities presented by globalization.
It's been quite a journey. And in our final part, we're going to turn our attention to the voices of young Ethiopians themselves. What do they think about love, marriage, and the future of their country? Stick around to find out.
Welcome back to our final segment. We've gone deep into Ethiopian marriage customs, from those ancient traditions to the impact of globalization. But now I'm excited to hear directly from the people actually living these changes.
Young Ethiopians themselves.
Exactly. We've got some really interesting excerpts from interviews and social media posts.
To give us a glimpse into their lives.
How are they navigating love and marriage in this, rapidly changing world?
It's a really fascinating mix, to be honest. One of the themes that keeps coming up is this push and pull between what they personally want and what their families expect.
Right, of course.
So many young people want to choose their own partners, but, respecting family approval is still really important.
So it's not about rejecting tradition, but about wanting a little more say.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance. One young woman put it beautifully in a social media post. She said something like, "Finding a middle ground where my heart and my family's blessings can coexist."
Wow. That's powerful.
It is.
It really speaks to that respect for family that's so central to Ethiopian culture, but also, that yearning for agency.
Definitely. We also have this excerpt from an interview with a young man. He fell in love with someone from a different religion,
Okay.
and he talked about the challenges, facing disapproval from his family, the courage it took to stand by his choice.
Wow, that must have been incredibly difficult.
It was. It really highlights that clash between personal desires and societal norms.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not just interface relationships, it's career aspirations,
Yeah.
lifestyle choices. Lots of young women are prioritizing education, careers,
Hmm.
which can lead to, delaying marriage, challenging those traditional gender roles.
So it's not just who you marry, it's about when and how you build your life.
Exactly. It's a big shift. And it leads to some, Some interesting family dynamics. One young woman said her parents were hesitant about her focusing on her career,
Uh-huh.
but they came around when they saw her dedication, her success.
That's good to hear. Families can adapt.
They can, even if it means questioning some deeply held beliefs. It shows how strong those family bonds are
It does.
and that willingness to find common ground.
Now, we've talked about globalization and particularly technology. I'm curious to know, how are young people using social media, dating apps to either, uphold or challenge these traditional norms?
Well, social media is a powerful tool for self-expression. Young people are using it to voice their opinions, share their experiences, connect with others who think like them. It's a place to, really question those traditions, advocate for more freedom.
So it's more than just finding dates online.
Way more. It's about building community, shaping a new dialogue around love and marriage. It's about using technology to empower themselves.
That's amazing. But are there any downsides to all this?
Of course, some worry about, the superficiality of it all, that pressure to present a perfect image. And there's always the risk of scams, catfishing, cyberbullying, all that.
So like many aspects of globalization, it's complicated.
It is.
It's a double-edged sword.
It's about using technology thoughtfully, you know, being aware of those potential risks.
No, can't ignore the economic side of things. The rising cost of living, the pressure on men to be providers. How are young people coping with all that?
It's a huge worry for a lot of them. They're concerned about being able to afford marriage, family life. Some are delaying marriage until they feel more financially stable. Others are having smaller, more affordable ceremonies and celebrations.
So it's, yeah, practicality,
Right.
a key factor in all this.
For sure. And we're also seeing a shift in attitudes about women working. It's not just the man's responsibility to bring home the money anymore. More and more couples are going for a partnership, both contributing financially.
Okay, that's great to hear. So maybe economic necessity is driving this shift towards more balanced relationships.
I think so. It reflects the reality for a lot of families in Ethiopia.
Two incomes.
Yeah, to just make ends meet. It's amazing to see how all these different forces are shaping marriage in Ethiopia.
It is fascinating, a complex, and dynamic process, challenges and opportunities.
Absolutely.
So, as we wrap up, what are your final thoughts on the future of marriage in Ethiopia?
Well, despite all the challenges, I'm optimistic.
Oh, good.
I think Ethiopian marriage traditions will keep evolving to reflect the changing needs of its people. We'll see that mix of old and new continue with a stronger focus on choice, on equality, and I hope we see more understanding, the
Yeah,
importance of communication, compromise, respect, all of that.
that's a beautiful vision. It reminds us that marriage, no matter what form it takes,
Yeah.
is really about love, commitment, and that journey two people take together.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And remember, we've only just scratched the surface here.
There's so much more to learn, to explore, to talk about.
If you're interested, keep digging.
Yes.
Seek out those stories, those different viewpoints.
Keep the conversation going.
Exactly.
The joy of learning is in that journey,
It is.
not just the destination. Well, that wraps up this deep dive on Ethiopian marriage customs. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.